Richard Boyd Barrett.
I'm going to go on and talk about some of the details of the budget in a minute, but I do feel the need to respond to some of the debate that has unfolded since Tuesday. And in particular, interestingly enough, a number of attacks on the Anti-Austerity Alliance People Before Profit by our friends from Fianna Fail. Fianna Fail and Fine Gael, true to form as birds of a feather who flock together when they are actually being challenged, have waxed lyrical about the centre of politics, the need to protect the centre, about their great prudence, and have attacked what they describe as the extremes of politics, which are characterised explicitly as ourselves, People Before Profit, the Anti-Austerity Alliance. We're apparently extremists. Now, I think it's very, very important to come back on that really quite ridiculous charge, although I think it is worth noting that notwithstanding the theatrics of Fianna Fail today, distancing themselves from some of the increasingly unpopular measures taken by the government in the budget, particularly the subsidy to first-time buyers that is being proposed, the tax break to first-time buyers, that they both band together to try and attack those on the left and try and characterise us as extremists. There was a very good book, I think written by Tariq Ali, called The Extreme Centre, where he sought to turn the narrative of the centre versus the extremes rightly on its head. Because, you see, I find it very difficult to understand how a party whose policies precipitated the greatest economic collapse in the history of the state, and then unloaded the cost, €64 billion worth of that cost, onto the backs of working people, of the poor, of the deprived, of women, children, the disabled, how they can talk about being the prudent centre. It is laughable in the extreme. Nothing is more extreme than the economic collapse that you lot precipitated in 2008. That was the most extreme event we've had since the foundation of the state. And it resulted in a 20% on average drop in the incomes of ordinary people, 30,000 public sector workers axed, €3 billion cut from the health budget, effectively the cessation of the social housing building programme, brutal attacks on the disabled, on lone parents, on public sector workers, the cutting by Fianna Fail of the minimum wage, levels of poverty and deprivation, in some cases doubling for some categories of our society. That is extremism. And that extremism of what you did that led up to the crisis, of course, was a product of the extremism which was to pamper, support the greediest people in Irish society. Bankers on obscene salaries, allowing these people to dictate, and the private developers and the landlords and so on, whose naked greed for profit you supported and championed at every hand's turn. And the cost was an absolutely catastrophic economic crisis. That is what I call extremism. And of course, it is telling, it is very, very telling, that the very policies that Fianna Fail championed, that led up to the crisis of 2008, are now being continued or resurrected by Fine Gael. specifically in this budget, proving once again there's not a whit of difference between you lot. And that notwithstanding the theatrics, the theatre that we get in here, where you jockey for political position and posture in front of the public, in reality the policies are always the same, regardless of which one of you is in government, or, as is the case now, both of you in government together, although one of you pretending to be the opposition. But the policies are the same, and that's what we got in the budget. Faced with the worst housing crisis in the history of the state, resulting from your policies of championing the interests of developers and bankers, and then the vicious austerity that you imposed that have combined to create that homelessness and housing crisis, what is the answer of Fine Gael? Unbelievably, more tax breaks and subsidies for private landlords and developers. I mean, really, you could not make this stuff up. And the truth of all of the much-trumpeted Coveney housing plan exposed in its stark reality in this budget. I mean, how many nonsense figures have we had put out from Minister Coveney? About 100, and before him Alan Kelly, I should say, that we were going to deliver 110, is it now up to 140,000 social housing units? But then you actually come to the budget and you see the reality. Not 47,000, not 110,000, not 140,000, but in black and white, in the expenditure report, 1,500. 1,500 new social housing units next year, and not even all of those are local authority. That includes approved housing bodies, these rapid build things that you are promoting rather than the bricks and mortar that people want, acquisitions and so on. Only 1,500. Which will not even account, I suspect, for 2 or 3 months of the new applicants that will come on the housing list in the next period. If that's all you're proposing to deliver, the problem will be worse. The housing and homelessness crisis will be worse by the end of the year with these measures. But the reality of your housing programme is massive handouts to private developers and to private landlords. 105 million extra to the housing assistance payment scheme, which is money straight into the pockets of private landlords. Doesn't deliver one new social housing unit. In fact, in most cases, the people who will be under the HAP scheme will be staying exactly where they are, in exactly the same private rented accommodation they are currently in, where they're getting rent allowance, but it will just be recategorised as a housing assistance payment. Similarly, 134 million going to the RAS scheme, which is again a direct payment by the state to private landlords, so that the housing applicants will stay exactly where they are now, in exactly the same private rented accommodation, costing the public a fortune, and then €200 million to go in grants, infrastructure grants to private developers, incredibly, to build private housing from which they will profit on public land. Absolutely naked and dramatic privatisation of public land, which we will pay for, but the private developers will be the ones that will benefit from it. And then, of course, you have the famous Help to Buy scheme, €50 million, which will simply bid up the price of property for buyers and go straight into the pockets of the private developers, but will not deliver any affordable or social housing. So that is the reality. And of course, it's worth exposing in that regard the sort of double counting that goes on consistently from Minister Coveney and this government when it comes to housing. 1.2 billion. This is the big figure. But then you'd actually look at the expenditure increase that the Department of Housing and Local Government is going to get, and it's only 400 million. Not 1.2 billion, 400 million. Over and above last year, and included in that is a 7% cut, a 30 million cut in the money going to local government. And that means libraries, local services, the people who clean the roads, cleansing departments and all that kind of stuff. Cut from the local government budget. Then we move on to health. And again, we have fibs from the government. Minister Donoghue stands up and says, on Tuesday, proudly, that this year, 2017, will be the highest level, I'm quoting directly, the highest ever level of health funding in the history of our country. Simply not true. In 2008, the budget was 15.4 billion. If you include capital, it was 16 billion, and the budget for 2017 is only 14.6. Now, you don't have to be a mathematician to work out that that means we had a higher health spend in 2008 than we have here. So I hope Minister Donoghue is going to correct the record. Now, that 14.6, which is less than 2008, does represent an increase on the estimate of last year, and again there was much trumpeting of that in the budget speech, but failing to acknowledge that 500 million euro of that is taken up in the overrun, the cost overrun of the health service from last year, 300 million with the pay increases for Lansdowne Road, and at least 300 million that is necessary to stand still in terms of service provision, given the additional demographic pressures of an older population and more demand on the health system. So that actually means it will have a minus effect, or at best a neutral effect in terms of service delivery in the health service. And that is a disaster, as we know. If there is no real increases, genuine increases in health expenditure, then the suffering for those on waiting lists, on trolleys in A&E, for those looking for home care packages, for the desperately needed funding we need for mental health, for the increased funding we need for the disabled in a whole range of areas, none of that can be delivered with a budget that in effect is neutral or possibly minus in real terms when you strip out all of the things I just mentioned. Similarly, in education, much crowing about a 458 million increase, but of course, when you strip out demographic pressures of 10,000 extra students coming into the education system every year, the extra teaching posts you are proposing will just about keep pace with the extra students coming into the system. And therefore, is it any surprise that there's no mention of class sizes or pupil-teacher ratios, because in fact the extra funding is only keeping pace with that extra demand. On the issue of arts, I heard the Arts Minister coming back on the point I think we were the first to raise on Tuesday about the 16% cut in the arts. And bearing in mind, this is against a background where we have the lowest level of expenditure as a proportion of GDP on arts almost anywhere in Europe. And last year, you gave an extra 50 million for the centenary and then took it back again, when the whole arts community was saying, look, really we'd like to get to European averages in terms of arts spending, but can you at least leave us with the 50 million extra you gave us last year? But no, you take 30 million of that back in a disgusting cut, when in fact we need significant increase in the arts budget. Just the last 20 seconds, a shout out for young people. I got a letter from the National Youth Council of Ireland when they said, why has the government in this budget further widened the gap between the rates of other adult welfare recipients and young welfare recipients by only giving them half, 270 extra or 380 extra compared to the fiver they've given to everybody else. Why have you widened the gap? I'd like an answer to that. So this is a miserable budget, full, frankly, of falsehoods by the ministers, various ministers in their speeches on Tuesday.
Tá hart fa sé bommate fáca